All right, welcome back, everyone. So we're going to continue here looking at some specific endocrine hormones, and then we'll also continue looking at specific glands as well. So we're going to pick up here looking specifically at growth hormone, right? So recall growth hormone is released from what endocrine gland, right? Remember, it's released from the anterior pituitary, and it's stimulated or inhibited from being released by two different hormones: growth hormone releasing hormone or growth hormone inhibiting hormone, right? So remember, if it has the term releasing or inhibiting, right, where is it from? It's from the hypothalamus, right? And so the amount of these different hormones, the releasing hormone and the inhibiting hormone, will obviously affect the amount of growth hormone. And this is going to vary based on a number of different factors, right? So this could be your age, time of day, nutrient levels, stress, and exercise. And we'll look at some of those examples here in just a moment, right? So whenever growth hormone, when it's ultimately released from the anterior pituitary, remember the anterior pituitary, it's also referred to as the adeno hypophysis, right? The posterior was called the neuro hypophysis. So when you release this growth hormone from the anterior pituitary, it stimulates several things. One, it can stimulate the release of IGFs, right? Remember, IGFs are insulin-like growth factors, and they function like growth hormone, but in a slightly different way, in the sense that they have a longer half-life, essentially meaning they last longer, right? It takes longer for the IGFs to have half of their concentration be removed in the blood, right? So we mentioned in a previous lecture that in order for a hormone or any molecule to act on a cell, then that cell has to have a specific receptor, right? And essentially all cells have receptors for growth hormone and or IGFs, right? So this means most cells, pretty much all cells, are affected by the release of growth hormone, right? And in general, we're talking about enhancing or promoting metabolism, growth, cell division and differentiation, protein synthesis, things like this, right? So we're releasing energy, we're creating energy, we are building things, we are promoting cell division, right? So all of these nutrient processes that you see down here, so glycogenolysis, gluconeogenesis, glycogenesis, lipolysis, lipogenesis, all of these processes that are regulated by growth hormone are promoting the release of, or the freeing up of, nutrients, right? So glycogenolysis, this term glycogen, right? Remember, glycogen is it's a polysaccharide, right? It's lots of individual sugar units bound together. And then lysis, anytime you see this term lysis here, lysis down here, that means to split or to break down or to break apart, right? So if you have glycogenolysis, then that means you are breaking down glycogen, right? Well, if you break down glycogen, what are you releasing? You're releasing glucose, right? So now our cells have the ability to use glucose for protein synthesis, cell division, whatever, right? Whatever we need to do. Gluconeogenesis is also going to be stimulated. This is essentially this kind of interconversion of one nutrient into glucose. So in other words, making glucose from a non-carbohydrate source, right? So again, increasing glucose levels. Glycogenesis we would inhibit, right? Why would we inhibit glycogenesis? Well, we'd inhibit glycogenesis because what we want is glycogenolysis, right? So this glycogenesis, genesis is meaning like the production of, right? Or the beginning of. So in this case, we are making glycogen, right? Which means we're decreasing blood sugar levels, right? Well, if we're trying to increase or release nutrients, that's the exact opposite of what we want to do, right? Same reason we're also going to inhibit lipogenesis, right? But we're going to enhance lipolysis, right? For the same reason we enhanced glycogenolysis, right? We're breaking down triglycerides, freeing up the free fatty acids, and our cells can use those for metabolism, right? So maybe for production of ATP, something like that, right? So this is kind of showing a schematic of how growth hormone is regulated, right? So you can see at the very top, right, you have some stimulus, one of those factors we talked about earlier, like so blood levels, age, time of day, nutrient, stress, and exercise. You release growth hormone, you release growth hormone releasing hormone, remember, from the hypothalamus, stimulates growth hormone to be released from the anterior pituitary, stimulates the liver to release some of those IGFs, right? But then growth hormone itself also enters the bloodstream, right? Remember we said that endocrine organs are very vascular, right? Because the way in which they transport their hormones is through blood, right? So the IGFs from the liver, the growth hormone from the anterior pituitary enter into the bloodstream, right? And they then travel along in the blood to begin moving toward their target tissue, right? And so you can see various target tissues down here, right? Whatever these effectors are that are responding to growth hormone and the IGFs. So enhancing bone growth, enhancing muscle development and growth, so via protein synthesis, right? Pretty much all cells for cell differentiation, right? So cell division, liver tissue as well, so those glycogenolysis, glycogenesis, lipogenesis processes we mentioned, and then fat as well, right? So increasing lipolysis, breaking down fat, freeing up fatty acids into the blood for our cells to use for metabolism, right? Now, like any good feedback loop, right? The increase in the amount of some molecule is typically going to act via negative feedback to control the amount that is being released, right? So what we see here, if we go to negative number 8 here, negative feedback, as we increase the amount of IGFs and growth hormone in the blood, that increased concentration is going to act via negative feedback to decrease the amount of growth hormone release, right? So we're going to decrease growth hormone release through the inhibition of growth hormone releasing hormone, which is going to decrease the amount of growth hormone that's released, which is going to decrease the amount of IGF that is produced and released, which is going to decrease the effects on all of these effectors, right? Until it drops again and you get the stimulation from growth hormone releasing hormone, and you release more growth hormone, and this process continues, right? So it's controlled via negative feedback in a very controlled way, right? So here you can see some various factors that affect growth hormone levels, right? So one, we said age, right? So typically as we age, our growth hormone levels decrease, right? We start off with a very large amount, a very great concentration of growth hormone releasing hormone. You also get this massive pulse, this big release around the time of puberty, right? So whenever you hit what you may call your growth spurt, right? Growth hormone acts on cartilage cells in the bone to promote the growth of that epiphyseal plate that contributes to interstitial bone growth, which contributes to you getting taller, right? And so that's one main hormone that is involved with your increase in height during your growth spurt. And you can also see it is going to it's going to fluctuate based on the time of day, right? So during sleep, it typically becomes relatively low. As we go throughout the day, it stays relatively steady. It then begins to increase, and then it will begin to drop again as we move into the next sleep period, right? So it fluctuates throughout the day based on our circadian rhythm, right? Now, there are various cases related to the oversecretion, so the hypersecretion, or the undersecretion, called the hyposecretion of growth hormone, right? So you may have heard of something called growth hormone insufficiency. You may hear it called pituitary dwarfism. You may hear something called pituitary gigantism, and then you may hear one called acromegaly, right? Acromegaly. So just a little summary on some of these. The major differences are one is whether it's a hypersecretion or hyposecretion, and then when it occurs. So in other words, does it occur during childhood or adolescence, or does it occur during adulthood, right? So pituitary insufficiency or growth hormone insufficiency, pituitary dwarfism, is a undersecretion, a hyposecretion of growth hormone during childhood, right? Pituitary gigantism, leading to a massive growth in height, right, an increased growth lengthwise, is a hypersecretion also during childhood. And then one called acromegaly is also a hypersecretion, but during adulthood, right? So there are important variations between these, right? So here's a case study, and you consider which, just consider the questions that are posed, right? So you have a 14-year-old male. He develops brain tumor, which affects the amount of growth hormone secreted, right? So first off, what gland is the tumor affecting? Okay, so we know that it's affecting the amount of growth hormone that's being secreted. So what gland is being affected? Hopefully you're thinking the anterior pituitary, right? What would you expect to see in this patient? So let's say, I don't think I listed it here. Let's say develops a brain tumor which affects the amount of hormone secreted. Let's say that it's an increase in secretion. So it's a hyper-secreting tumor. So meaning now this 14-year-old male has an increased level of growth hormone that's being produced, right? So what would you expect to see in this patient? Maybe over the next 6 months, over the next year, something like that, right? Hopefully you're saying you would begin to see an increase in height, right? There's this increase in lengthwise growth, right? Interstitial growth due to the effect of growth hormone on the cartilage and the epiphyseal plate, right? So now you're beginning to grow taller, right? So this is occurring in a 14-year-old male, right? So we said that this is an adolescent, right? Still growing. How would this case differ if the patient was 37 years old, right? So now we're no longer an adolescent. Now we are an adult. What would you expect to see, or what would you not expect to see if everything else is held constant, right? So say you still have a brain tumor, it's still hypersecreting, and you still have growth hormone release, right? So in this case, would you see this individual, this 37-year-old patient, would you see this individual begin to have an increase in height, right? Would they begin to get taller, right? Yes or no? What do you think? Say it out loud. I can't hear you, but say it out loud. We would not expect them to get any taller, right? The reason for that is something we talked about when we did skeletal system, right? And that's the fact that we have our epiphyseal plate, right? Our growth plate, it's now closed by this time. By the time you're 37, it's been closed for a while, right? So your epiphyseal plate or growth plate is now an epiphyseal line or an epiphyseal scar. No more cartilage, so you get no more increase in the amount of cartilage, so you don't get any more interstitial growth, right? You don't get any more lengthwise vertical growth, so you're not getting any taller, right? So what you may see then is instead of the bones getting longer, you may see the bones begin to increase in thickness, right? So you may get some appositional growth, right? And so I'll show you some images. So these are images of the three conditions that we looked at, right? So you have pituitary gigantism, you have growth hormone insufficiency, and you have acromegaly, right? So the big one here for our case study is if it was a hyper-secreting, tumor secreting growth hormone in a child or adolescent, you'd end up with an increase in stature, right, in terms of height, right? So you become very, very tall. For acromegaly, instead of getting the increase in height, you'd get the increase in the thickness and the overall massiveness of bone. So typically you see this in things like the jaw, right? The jaw becomes very pronounced. You also get an increase in growth, maybe some bones of the forehead, right? So maybe part of your frontal bone. Hands as well become very, very large, right? So the main difference between acromegaly and pituitary gigantism, right, a hypersecretion of growth hormone during childhood, is one, that the age, right, but then also the fact that during childhood your bones are still growing, right? You still get this lengthwise growth of bone. So if you have that hypersecretion, you can end up becoming incredibly tall, but with acromegaly, you don't get that increase in height. Okay, so we will stop here, stop with growth hormone, and then we will pick up in our next part and we'll begin looking at the thyroid gland.